those governments, those political figures, from across the spectrum, including Conservatives, including Labour figures, I would argue have been lying to the British people.
It does seem at the moment as though the violence has subsided, and we've seen over 700 people arrested. Do you think this shows that the government's approach to this is working?
I think it's too early to say that. I think, firstly, everybody in the country, myself included, condemns violence on all sides. But I think the government's reaction to the unrest has been very much focused on the criminality aspect. I don't personally think we've come close to discussing the root causes of the rioting and protests. So from my perspective, at least, we may well be able to restore calm and peace in the days and weeks ahead. But until we get into the much more important discussion about what is driving all of this, that may not be a durable peace over the longer term. And that's my concern at the moment.
The Prime Minister has described those responsible for the violence as far-right thugs. We've seen over 700 people arrested, over 300 in court. And when you look at some of those who've been convicted for things like violent disorder, attacking the police, throwing rocks and stones at hotels, housing asylum seekers, and so on, do you not think that perhaps the Prime Minister is justified that this is the work of thugs, and that people, as he puts it frequently, need to just feel the full force of the law?
Well, I don't think anybody in this country would disagree with the suggestion that criminals and people who break the law should be arrested and face the consequences for their actions, and not just people within the white British community, but also people within minority communities too, who we've seen picking up weapons and engaging in what looks to me like organized violence. So I think the Prime Minister is absolutely right to say that. However, it is also true that many of the people who have been drawn into peaceful protests in recent days and weeks cannot simply be dismissed as far-right thugs. We've seen in the polling in recent days that significant numbers of British people, between 40 and 60%, depending how you ask the question, either think peaceful protests are justified, express sympathy for those protesters, or indeed express open support. About 34% of British adults say they support peaceful protests. So for me, again, I'm certainly not arguing with the suggestion that we should be arresting people who break the law. But for me, there is something much bigger going on here, which comes down to our unresolved concerns held by many people in this country over the fact we're not controlling our national borders, we're not reducing mass migration. We have a model of multiculturalism in this country which is clearly prioritizing differences among groups over what brings them together, and which ultimately, Carol, is leading many people to the conclusion that they are no longer safe in Britain. And this is a discussion, at least I've been saying all week, this is a discussion we're going to have to get into if we're serious about dealing with the root causes.
Well, some of those who are saying that they no longer feel safe in Britain are from ethnic communities. Do you not think that there's a danger, Matthew, that in talking like this, you give the appearance of justifying some of what's been going on?
No, I think that's a very unhelpful response. Let's compare the England riots in 2011 under what was then a Conservative-led coalition and the riots of 2024. Now, I remember in 2011, the main narrative coming from particularly the left of British politics was that those riots were not only about criminality, they were about wider grievances over austerity, public sector cuts, economic deprivation. So why is it that people can look at those riots and say, well, there are clearly wider issues at play, But when it comes to the riots in 2024, we're given this narrative that this is chiefly about far-right thuggery, and there are no wider issues at play. And I think many people in this country feel very frustrated about that. It is immediately obvious when you listen to the things people are saying at these protests that this is about immigration policy in this country. In fact, YouGov's poll this week found that 67% of Brits, more than 2/3, blame recent immigration policy for these disturbances and riots. So if the question is, well, is it irresponsible to talk about the wider issues? I would personally respond by saying it is responsible to point to those wider issues if we're serious about dealing with the community tensions and division that we have in this country. People might like to put...
But we've had endless discussion of immigration, haven't we, over the past few years. It's been absolutely central to a lot of the arguments within the Conservative Party. Labour says they do have an approach, a different approach. They've obviously dropped the plan to send some migrants to Rwanda, but they've got this plans for a new command force. They are processing asylum seekers' claims. Isn't that the answer, along with the tough approach from law and order, people being arrested and charged?
Oh, no, that's not the answer. Nothing, we might be talking about migration. Nothing's happening. Consistently from 2016 to 2017 to 2019, we've had referendums and governments that have promised the British people they would lower migration and regain control over the country. Those governments, those political figures, from across the spectrum, including Conservatives, including Labour figures, I would argue have been lying to the British people. The opposite has happened. Net migration has gone up to 700,000. We've lost control of the borders. We have no serious plan for dealing with illegal migration. I've yet to meet anybody in the National Crime Agency who thinks Labour's plan is going to work. And on top of that, and this is where I'm really concerned, Carol, Labour on the one hand are saying this is about far-right thuggery and criminality, and meanwhile are further liberalising the migration system. They've made changes so we have more migration from Afghanistan. They've removed the salary thresholds on family migration. They've removed the Rwanda plan. They've amended the Illegal Migration Act. They've basically given more incentives for people to try and get into Britain, either legally or illegally. So look, I'm going to be an outlier in this debate. I'm saying very clearly, if we want to restore peace, order, cohesion, and trust into our society, we have to get serious about dealing with the concerns over our broken borders and the policy of mass immigration. That is, I think, backed up by evidence. It's not a popular view in London and Oxford and Cambridge, but I think that is ultimately what we need to do if we're going to reunify this country and make it a stronger, more prosperous place to live.
Well, I should point out, of course, that net migration is now coming down, partly as a result of those changes to the
to
5 to
600,000 a year, Carol. Come on, I remember the days when 300,000 a year was considered high. You see, we've lost perspective as to what is considered normal and what is not. Saying that net migration is coming down to 500, 600,000 when it was 300,000 at the time of the Brexit referendum. This is what people out there in the country are saying. And also the evidence that actually this is building a strong, vibrant economy is not there. It's simply not there. We've built a low-wage, low-skill economy, a Deliveroo economy that's basically dependent upon mass migration to plug holes in our economy and keep consumption going. I mean, this is the elephant in the room.
One other issue that's being discussed in relation to the riots that we've seen. We've had Priti Patel, a former Home Secretary, now a leadership contender, saying that she thinks that we do need to address this perception of two-tier policing, the idea which has been dismissed by both the government and by the police, that police forces crack down harder on right-wing protesters. What do you think of that? Do you think that Priti Patel has a point?
Well, I think overall, we need to have a serious discussion about the institutions in this country and whether they are, particularly the public institutions, whether they are genuinely politically impartial and independent. The point about policing is that many people who have been watching the reaction to the riots and the protests this week have been asking themselves a question, and I think it is a legitimate question actually, which is, well, if we are being asked to believe that the police are politically impartial and independent, why did we see police officers taking the knee during the Black Lives Matter protests? Why did we see police officers joining, what looked like to me was a Muslim show trial where a young boy with autism had accidentally scuffed a copy of the Quran, and police officers were sitting on this panel, essentially admonishing the family and the boy for doing so. This is the stuff, Carol, that's been going viral online over the last 2 weeks, because people are saying, look, we're happy to buy into the idea that the police are impartial and independent and above politics. But if we have to believe that, if we're being asked to believe that, then can the police stop politicizing themselves by doing things like taking the knee or embracing, political insignia and doing things that arguably the police, I would think the police should not be doing. We need to be condemning violence on all sides. I think we need to be drawing attention not just to people in the white British community who are being arrested and thrown into jail, rightly in many cases, but we also need to be pointing to the other examples, like the Labour councillor this week who openly called for the murder of people engaging in the riots and protests.
And that person has now facing charges,
which is great. But let's get some more examples of that. Let's show the British people that we are going to condemn violence on all sides. There is no place for violence in British society. There is no place for a two-tier, politically biased response to any disturbances in Britain. Because I'm saying this, Carol, because I'm deeply concerned about the way in which this government is already perceived. It's only a month old, barely a month old, 6 weeks old, this government. It's already seen by a large number of people in this country, as we've seen in the spat with Elon Musk, as a very one-sided government. So Keir Starmer, his ratings have collapsed this week already. He's down to -16 in the polls. He was -3 when he became prime minister. He's going to have to get his arms around this and accept it isn't just a criminality issue. It isn't just about law and order. There is a perception running through this country that the Labour government prioritizes and favors minority groups over the majority. And it views much of the country as being far right. And it is not applying the law evenly and equally. And that's a dangerous place for a government to be over the longer term, particularly as the underlying issues, as I've said, over migration, the collapse of our borders, as those issues are going to become much more pressing